Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. I apologize for our speaker's popularity. Do the best you can. We have every auxiliary chair in the building in this room, so do the best you can. Thank you for coming. My job is just simply to announce that I represent the Nicholas D. Chabraya Center for Historical Studies, which is literally beneath us in this building. And we host a number of activities every year, including visiting speakers by eminent historians from around the world. We host some other activities, our international program and some undergraduate program called the Leopold Undergraduate Fellowships. And one of the great joys of being the director has been reaching out to other areas in the university, and the university librarian has been most helpful in creating this event today, which is now in its third iteration of the history of the book, or activities about the history of writing and literacy. I'm glad you all came today. My colleague, Ed Muir, who knows the Renaissance field better than I could ever know, will introduce Tony Grafton. Thank you for coming.
For those of you if you open that door, there are chairs hidden. No? They're all gone? Oh, so I'm all wrong. So I'll take that back. Ignore me completely on that score, at least. Introducing one seat up here, yeah. Introducing Anthony Grafton presents, for me, certainly a bit of a challenge. Not because there is any difficulty in telling the story of Tony's many distinctions, but because he is one of our leading experts on the history of rhetoric. And so the rules of epidictic rhetoric buzzing in my head, I've become cautioned, first, that he will see through my tricks, and second, that in this audience I might be preaching to the choir, because, as Socrates used to say, it is not difficult to praise Athenians in Athens. Moreover, does not too much praise dilute the effect? In this case, I think not. Tony is the most distinguished scholar of Renaissance thought alive today. The Henry Putnam University Professor of History at Princeton, the immediate past president of the American Historical Association. It is over, right, Tony? He is the author of more than 10 books, I think, if I've counted them correctly, the co-author, the editor, the co-editor, or translator of at least 9 others. And for those of you outside of the small magical world of Renaissance studies, he is also a regular contributor to the New Republic, the American Scholar, and of course the New York Review of Books. Now, what distinguishes his books is their pervasive humanity, their empathy for the humanist project of discovering the meaning of words of the past so as not to play tricks on the dead, just as the rhetorician must not play tricks on the living. In fact, avoiding anachronism may be the historian's greatest obligation, that is, to give the dead a presence without making them one of us. And that is exactly what Tony's scholarship has done. In Tony's work, he seeks for the larger picture of the past in little things, clues in language and images, and if you don't believe me, take a look at his tie, which consists of nuts and bolts. The little things tell everything. Examples are in Joseph Scaliger's obsession with grammar, in his study of the architect Leon Battista Alberti's tormented self-doubt, in the polymath Girolamo Cardano's investigations of the curative powers of the stars, or apropos to today's lecture, in Niccolo Perotti's warning that leaving even the smallest collections of texts up to entrepreneurial printers to the vicissitudes of the capitalist marketplace would prove a disaster for scholarship and for our truths about the past. As the true heir of his teacher Arnaldo Momigliano, Tony loves words as much as his humanist subjects did. Witness some of his titles: Bring Out Your Dead, Codex in Crisis, Defenders of the Text, Worlds Made by Words, I Have Always Loved the Holy Tongue, and the favorite of historians, The Footnote, A Curious History. Perhaps one of his greatest honors, besides the Baltzan Prize, the rare honorary degree from Leiden University, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Distinguished Achievement Award, is the singular pedagogical achievement of having inspired two of his undergraduate students to write a murder mystery set at Princeton University and revolving around a Renaissance text whose difficult interpretation Tony Grafton had introduced them to. And of course, in reading the text, you can find fragments of Tony scattered around among various characters in the novel. It is thus fitting to have Anthony Grafton deliver the lecture on the history of the books, jointly sponsored by the Shabraya Center for Historical Studies and Northwestern University Library, with its Grafton-esque title, Humanists with Dirty Figures, Renaissance Correctors, and the Origins of Editing. Tony.
Thank you so much, Tim, for having me. Thank you also to the librarian and to Northwestern Libraries. The Princeton University Library labeled me a heavy user a year after I arrived there in 1975, and though disquieted by their wording, I have been, I think, a heavy user and lover of libraries all my life. Thanks, too, to Ed for that lovely introduction. I would venture one small correction. I'm mostly the villain of that mystery. He didn't want to say so, but you think you've seen everything when you've taught for 35 years, and then you get an email from a former student saying, two of us have written this mystery, and our agent says the first printing is 250,000 copies, and you're the villain. Early on the morning of July 8, 1980, Raymond Carver wrote a despairing letter to his editor at Alfred A. Knopf, Gordon Lish, and you can guess which one is Carver and which one is Lish. I've got to pull out of this one. Please hear me. I've been up all night thinking on this. For years, Lish had cut the paths that Carver followed into the world of letters. As an editor, first at Esquire magazine and then at New York publishing houses, Lish had promoted Carver's short stories. But he'd also done more. Like a literary Procrustes, he had taken the long, elaborate manuscripts Carver sent him and chopped them almost beyond recognition until they fit his own supremely lean definition of an effective style. Some of them shrank by more than half of their original length. Now Lish had put the stories that Carver had assembled for the collection known as What We Talk About When We Talk About Love through a double process of reduction and rewriting. Carver rebelled. Friends had read and approved drafts of many of these stories. Some of them had appeared in magazines. Others had been accepted. Carver recognized the skill, the consummate skill, with which Lish had concentrated his stories, imposing that deadpan tone that came to be known as minimalism and inspired passionate imitation at writing programs around the country for 20 years. This time, though, Carver couldn't bear to have others know the extent to which Lish's file had shaped his stories. He begged Lish to cancel or postpone the project. How Lish responded is unclear. Years later, he recalled that my sense of it was that there was a letter and I just went ahead. Within a week, at any rate, Carver capitulated. While still asking that some cuts be restored, he wrote, I'm thrilled about the book and its impending publication. I'm stoked, and I'm already starting to think about the next one. What We Talk About When We Talk About Love appeared in exactly the form Lish had proposed. Enthusiastic critics identified the book as something new, a first expedition into a previously unknown literary country. In a review that became famous in its own right, Michael Wood zeroed in on what set the book's style apart, the artfully placed gaps. It's not that he lends speech to his characters or talks on their behalf. He hears what they're saying when the words run out. In Mr. Carver's silences, a good deal of the unsayable gets said. The only thing Wood didn't say was that these were Lish's silences where Carver had left words. Eventually, Carver shook off Lisch's bent nib and cultivated the fuller style that he himself preferred, but he would go to his grave famous against his will as the minimalist that Lisch had made him. Critics and readers have debated the value of Carver's prose and the plastic surgery that Lisch did upon it for years. I think most critics line up with Craig Raine, who, when on the occasion of the Library of America edition of Carver's works, which includes both originals and Lisch's rewritings, argued that the critic was far superior to the writer. The original manuscript, said Raine, is manifestly inferior. Lisch was an editor touched with genius, a kind of Michelangelo among editors who saw the statue within the block of marble. Now, Raine and the others who've debated this case have often compared Lisch to other modern editors, recalling that Ezra Pound slashed the rhymes from the draft of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, that Maxwell Perkins shaved mounds of typescript by Thomas Wolfe into things that looked like novels, that Charles Monteith hacked the first 30 pages out of Lord of the Flies, making it the austere, sharp book that we all know. These comparisons are perfectly apposite, but they lack a historical dimension. In this lecture, I invite you to return with me to an earlier world, that of the correctors of the Renaissance, the first literary professionals of the age of print that is now coming to an end. I want to invite you to join me in the lost realm of these lean, shabby, Bartleby-like figures who haunt the history of publishing in early modern Europe like so many specters, to explain something of what they did and how they worked, and to make clear why they became a central feature of literary life, and at the same time, why they became a hissing and a byword for their contemporaries. Finally, I hope to suggest that they deserve a central place in the history of the modern literary system. Our Virgil, who will take us into this underworld, is the Basel literary figure and press professional Theodor Zwinger. He was a highly skilled ethnographer. He actually wrote a book on the art of travel, designed for young men making the grand tour. And he carried out at the end of that book a kind of ethnography of the printing house and remarkably enough, in diagrammatic form, like a kind of anthropologist of the 1960s, avant la lettre. In the first of his charts, he shows you a table of organization and an inventory of equipment, materials, and operators to be performed with them in the printing house. At the top right, he notes that printers have employees of two sorts, theoretical and mechanical. The mechanical employees are compositors who set the type and pressmen who ink the forms and print the pages. The theoretical employees are correctors who correct the proofs and readers who read the original copy aloud or read the proofs aloud while the correctors check it. Zwinger's second image is a crisp flowchart. Yes, we are, right? Which shows how a printed text takes shape. Correctors and readers, he explains, examine the proofs that are produced by the pressman and correct the errors in them. That's formal correction. Then the compositors take those corrections back to the form and make what he calls material corrections. So, just to remind you, this is what a sheet looks like printed for a single gathering of a duodecimo book. This whole sheet would be pulled at once by the pressman. The corrector would check all 12 pages and make corrections, and then the pressman would enter corrections, changing the type in the forms, which would have to be unlocked, changed, and put back. And Zwinger points out that this process took place 3 times. So the pressman would pull 3 proofs, and the correctors would check the first proof against the original copy, the second proof against the original copy, the third proof against the second proof, and then they would pass the page for print, and 1,000 copies of the sheets would be pulled, normally in a single day, and then the type would be broken up. We have other evidence that confirms that this was the basic routine, at least in the great printing houses of Basel, where Zwinger worked, and the other centers of printing like Venice, Lyon, and Paris. And that's the kind of house that I'll be talking about tonight. We also have every reason to be depressed on behalf of the correctors. For if Zwinger's account were complete, all these men who had to be literate and learned, most of them university graduates, did was to correct proofs over and over again. Pull a sheet, read the proof. Pull the sheet, read the proof. Give it back to the compositors, rinse and repeat the next day. It sounds diabolically boring. Now, we'll hear that the corrector's task had its problems, but boredom wasn't one of them. Fritz Finger's diagrams were actually radically oversimplified, like any good social anthropologist's diagrams in the 1960s. They provide an ideal type. In fact, jobs overlapped in the printing house in ways that he didn't begin to suggest. Here's a wood engraving from the early 17th century. It actually comes from the first manual of how to correct proofs, the Orthotypographia of Jerome Hornschuch. And what it shows you is an actual printing shop with a lot going on. So on your left, you can see the pressman actually pulling sheets. Behind them, you see a colleague lifting a wet sheet to dry on a wire rack at the level of the ceiling. One thing we often forget about early printing houses is that they would have been flapping like a ship with flags 100 years ago, because the sheets would always be hung from the ceiling to dry. And it's something you rarely see in these illustrations. On the right, you see an apprentice sitting, moistening paper so that it'll take the ink. At the end of the room, you can see a woman coming through a door carrying a Maß, a big German mug of beer. The pressmen were given a Maß of beer every time they finished pulling a sheet. Authors complained that this did not make for greater precision. In the foreground stands the master printer, a gorgeous figure in a splendid fur-collared robe, who seems to be counting on his fingers. Like most great publishers, then or now, I presume that he lives like a Maharaja but is always on the verge of bankruptcy. Henri Estienne, for example, the great Geneva printer, trained his servant never to bring him a letter except several hours before or after a meal, since all his news spoiled his appetite whenever he got it. Only one fly gets in the ointment here, but it's a big one and buzzing loudly. Why is no one doing any correcting? This is a handbook for correctors. The answer is simple. The term corrector actually corresponds not to corrector in modern terminology, if we still had any correctors, which of course we don't, but to something like print professional. Correctors carried out a multitude of tasks. They marked copy in the first place before it went to the compositors. This is Conrad Telecon, who was a famous corrector for the Basel houses of Amerbach and Froben. Telecon began his career as a corrector marking up the type of Augustine on Christian doctrine. On your left, you see a copy of the first edition. On your right, the beautifully laid out copy that Telecon laid out for Froben, each page with text and commentaries carefully laid out in different type fonts to make clear the relation of each part of the page to the whole. A beautiful piece of work, and one of which he was very proud. He kept his own copy of it, which is now in Louvain. He's actually marked all the parts of it for which he laid out the mise en page. He drew up indexes. Here you see an index to the work of the Latin church father Cyprian with a little preface in the name of the printer, Johannes Froben, who of course actually didn't know any Latin. So that's Telecon writing in his name and saying, here's the index which I have done only page by page, not section by section of the page, since I didn't want to encourage readers to be lazy. A nice piece of having it both ways. Correctors composed blurbs. Francesco Rolandello, who corrected the first edition of Marsilio Ficino's translation of the dialogues of Hermes Trismegistus, the supposed Egyptian sage, added a note on the title page, which you see on the right, in which he speaks in the voice of the orator. You, reader, whether you're a grammarian or an orator or a theologian or a philosopher, know that I am that thrice greatest Hermes who was so much admired first by Egyptians and barbarians and later by Christian theologians. Buy me, and for a very low price you'll receive both pleasure and profit. As you see, they were really professionals. Now, if you go back to the back of Hornschuch's image, past the master printer, to the right, you see three men who look like gentlemen rather than workers. They're not wearing jerkins with open collars, but doublets with ruffs, arguing. I suspect that what we have here are precisely an author and a corrector arguing about the way the corrector has marked up copy. When you remember, and I won't be able for lack of time to go into this, that correctors were expected to punctuate and regulate the spelling of authors' manuscripts, you can imagine that there was often reason to expostulate. Literally, most authors' manuscripts arrived unpunctuated until the end of the handpress period in the 19th century, and the printing house decided where to drop in the commas, the semicolons, which the correctors invented in the periods. Like the webmasters and SCAD persons who perform vital functions in contemporary institutions, correctors have the look of a brand new occupational group and even a brand new social type, a phenomenon brought into being by the new invention of printing, native-born citizens of the new world of mass-produced books that printing created. The printer, after all, always had to deal with rivals. And he had to deal with them in the precarious position of one who had made a large investment in paper, in type, and in copy before he could even begin to recoup anything. One way to survive in this piranha-field literary marketplace was to emphasize in the colophon of a book or on the title page that it had been corrected by a superior scholar, particularly if, as was often the case in the first century of printing, the book in question was an ancient one. The claims became gaudy very soon when Beatus Rhenanus published the first edition of Velleius Paterculus, the Roman historian. The publisher's blurb, which Beatus actually wrote, claimed that he had reclaimed this author from death and brought him back to life. When Beatus wrote the blurb for Erasmus's edition of Seneca, which appeared in 1515, he wrote, and here you can hear in his lack of logic what happens to a corrector drafting a blurb at the very last moment, holding his paper steady on the head of a printer's devil. Here, best of readers, are all the works of that holy Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the philosopher, all his works and some others added as well. Thanks to the care of Erasmus of Rotterdam, they have been cleansed, if not of all their faults, at least of a great many of them. But then his literary flair came back to him. As you read these, if you do a careful job, they will polish your tongue and correct your life. So the works corrected by Erasmus will in turn correct the reader, a play on words that suggests something of the moral freight with which these tasks were expected to bear. Like our computer personnel, correctors devised their own technical jargon, which struck even those who supervised them as ugly. In September 1581, Christopher Plantin, great Antwerp printer, wrote to his friend, the scholar Benito Arias Montano, "I've been forced, in violation of my usual custom, to read, as they call them, printers' proofs, probae typographicae." In fact, he read them all the time, but he didn't like to admit that he used a word like proba typographica very often. Correctors devised their own system of signs, which any of you who has ever corrected a proof will recognize. This is the list from Hornschuch's handbook in 1609. These signs, of course, remain to this day the trademark of the professional proofreader. Raimundo Silva, the proofreader who is the anti-hero of José Saramago's wonderful novel, The History of the Siege of Lisbon, appears at the start of the book rhapsodizing about the best known, the deletion sign derived from the Greek delta. Yes, this symbol is called deleatur. We use it when we need to suppress and erase. The word speaks for itself and serves both for separate letters and for complete words. It reminds me of the snake that changes its mind just as it's about to bite its tail. The delta for deleatur was in full use as early as 1475, as this surviving print from the proof from the shop of Peter Schoeffer of a Roman law text shows in its margins. So the corrector, the maker of indexes, the verifier of text, the artisan of many proofreadings, seems to stand more generally for something like a new culture, one that emphasized linguistic and textual precision. And it did. It was the printing shops of Venice, for example, that really imposed uniformity on the Italian language in the 16th century. In the great printing shops, you really do see something like a new culture. Take Johann Amerbach, great Basel printer, one so dedicated to precision that if he found a mistake in a sheet that had already been printed off 1,000 times, he would junk it and have it redone the next day at great expense. Those who entered his sphere felt a terrifying pressure for precision. Around 1507, a Basel schoolmaster, Jakob Brunn, wrote Ammerbach a revealing letter of apology. "My good sir, last night we had various discussions together back and forth. If I blurted out an error when we were speaking, I would like you to attribute it not so much to ignorance as to the slip of a tipsy tongue. I certainly know that I inflicted an injury on Priscian, the Roman grammarian, when I inadvertently said kenabar, when I should have said kenabam. I was dining. Therefore, please, my good sir, overlook it. Something like that can happen to anyone at any time. Even meticulous people are not so careful in speech as in writing." Two images from a profound and moving classic of the cinema will convey something of this grammarian's feelings. Conscientious correctors, of course, felt the pressure, this new pressure for precision and verifiability, more deeply than anyone else. To watch Theodor Pullman, for example, draft a short preface for a tiny little school edition of Virgil in 1564 is to watch a skillful Latinist cripplingly aware that the unforgiving eyes of Plantin were upon him, and his pen moves through an awkward dance, 2 words forward, 1 word back, 2 words forward, crossing out, 1 word back. Rather like IT now, correction came to be seen as an occupation that required a particular kind of person. Plantin's letter of recommendation for his son-in-law, Franciscus Raphaelengius, etches the scary portrait of an ideal corrector, scarier than the real portrait. He has never been passionately interested in anything so much as the study of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and Arabic, in which those who confer with him familiarly affirm that he is no mean scholar, and of the humanities, and he will correct loyally, carefully, and faithfully whatever you entrust to him, without ever seeking to parade his learning or show off, for he's very retiring and assiduous at every task assigned to him. So in theory, the corrector's job called for meticulous attention to detail, expert knowledge of languages, and a complete absence of selfishness and independent thought, the job for a man without qualities. In practice, though, correctors were known less for their stabilizing of texts than for corrupting them. When Silva, Saramago's fictional corrector, breaks with the habits of a lifetime and inserts a knot into a historical text, changing the entire narrative, he's following a rich tradition. As early as 1580, Henri Estienne described an acquaintance who, he said, carried out the corrector's task with incredible cruelty, inflicting terrible wounds on the text. For at every passage where he encountered the word prokos, suitors, he substituted porkos, pigs. For, as he said, I know that porkos are a kind of animal, but I don't think prokos means an animal in anything or anything else in Latin. Now, I don't know if this vision of the corrector as a kind of male Circe madly turning suitors into pigs is to be taken literally. But it's certainly true that stories passed of correctors making deliberate changes. Sometimes they were ideologically inspired. An 18th century antiquary who wrote the first history of correctors, which has 5 pages of errata, recalled with pleasure the Protestant corrector who had been publicly whipped in Catholic Würzburg when a reference to the Veronica or Schweißtuch of Jesus came out in a book he had corrected as Scheißtuch. Franciscus Junius recalled meeting a corrector who worked for the great house of Frelon at Lyon in 1559, who showed him sheet after sheet from editions of the Fathers of the Text, which he claimed the Franciscans had forced Frelon to pull out of his work and replace them with sheets that had been deliberately falsified. But sometimes correction simply stemmed from the corrector's vision of himself. The corrector was supposed to be selfless, but the corrector was the guardian of accuracy in Latin, in reference, in fact. And so Junius himself, when editing a second edition of Joseph Scaliger's edition of Manilius, which had appeared in 1579, felt that the requirements of his calling forced him to add a super commentary in which he corrected Scaliger's mistakes. Here is Scaliger's copy, in which you see him writing kakas, kakat, he's full of shit, and azine, and crossing out the entire 100 pages of Junius. There you see the kind of reaction that correctors often received from authors. So what did it feel like to do this job? What was a corrector's sense of self? Did the corrector see himself as the patient Griselda serving the author and the text, or the sovereign master ensuring precision which authors had missed? My French editor, Maurice Hollander, once arranged for me to have dinner with 6 correctors from French publishing houses and newspapers. And they sat for 3 hours telling me how incompetent all authors are. No author ever spells the same proper name the same way twice. None of them know the rules of syntax. None of them know the sequence of tenses. None of them can tell a subjunctive from an indicative. It was, except for the fact that I too was an author, it was a wonderful evening. But it suggested that the corrector was a complex being. So let me show you one at work, which comes from the extraordinary surviving materials from the Plantin House in Antwerp. The corrector in question was not a professional, but a converted Jew who was professor of Hebrew at Cologne, Johannes Isaac Levita, very proud of being a Levite. Plantin, who was preparing to publish a great polyglot edition of the Bible, this indeed came out in 1569 to 72, thought that as a preparatory work he would do a new edition of the Standard Christian Dictionary of Hebrew by Santes Pagnini. He bought a copy of this book. He brought Levita to his house, and Levita lived with the printer from November 1563 to October 1564, and Levita prepared this work for the press. The edition never appeared, but the book survives in the Leiden University Library. It migrated to Leiden with Ralph Alengius, Plantin's chief corrector, during the troubles of the later 1560s. Its tightly printed pages overgrown with thickets of annotation and supplemented by 44 more pages of manuscript notes. By looking at these notes, we can actually open a window into Plantin's shop and see what it was like to be a corrector there, gain an internal sense of the practices of a particular practitioner of this art. Now, I have to admit that Isaac was a fascinating and controversial character. Throughout his life, Christian critics suspected him of Judaizing. One wrote, for example, that he'd been seen at Jewish sacrifices in Deutz. I didn't know Jews sacrificed after the temple was destroyed, Second Temple was destroyed, but this is the report, at sacrifices at Deutz, wearing a linen ephod, a garment, of course, worn by the ancient high priest and by David, the look of which no one would have been able to reconstruct. As late as 1570, he was accused of misbehaving at Mass. In 1570, in Cologne, which was a rather orthodox center dominated by the Dominicans, he remained a marginal and controversial figure. And as a Hebrew professor, he had a very low salary. When he complained of poverty, the university authorities loaned him money to buy a house at 6%. As Elisheva Karlebach points out, they seem to have been oblivious to the paradox involved profiting by lending money to a Jew. More problematic still from the standpoint of correction, but not unknown, was Isaac's own level of culture. Though hired to correct a dictionary written in Latin, he was no master of Latin. He wrote a polemical work defending the integrity of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament against his Catholic critics, but in that work he confessed that he had written with the help of a certain young student who couldn't always be available when I wanted to consult him on difficulties. So he was not a fluent and correct Latinist. Nonetheless, he went to work with a will on the vast project that Plantin had assigned him to. And his notes let us see him developing a corrector's familiarity with printing house procedure. Let us see the scholar learning to have inky fingers. He learned to write out passages of Hebrew that he wanted to add to the text in the block letters with which Christian typesetters were familiar, rather than his own Jewish script, which they wouldn't have been able to read, to use deletion marks to indicate text to be omitted, and to write haik maneant when he wanted to say what we would say with step, this part should stay. When he wanted to indicate that a passage in one article should be set off by itself, and you see this over on your left, he wrote in German, this should be set in large letters and a space should be left for it's a new route. He learned the technical reasons why printers habitually made errors, and here you actually see a discussion of textual error. I'm not unaware of the cause. The error came from the printer. The letters samech and ayin are very close to one another in the case that holds all the type. The compositor could easily grab one in place of the other, or put an ayin in place of a samech, when he distributed the type. That's when the form is broken up and you put the type back in the case. Afterwards, the corrector didn't amend this mistake, and I doubt it's to be found in the handwritten copy. Elsewhere, encountering an irrelevant passage of Hebrew, he adopted a simpler explanation. This sentence must have been put in the wrong place by the printer's wine. An awkward way of saying that the compositor was drunk. So here you see him, the intellectual, the Hebraist of Jewish background, becoming a print professional. He did much more than correct errors. He actually inscribed the elements of a radical revision around the margins and into the text of this enormous and erudite book. You can see him making stylistic corrections, not on the Latin, but on the Hebrew of the title. Here he removes what he thinks is an otiose definite article in the second word, ha'otzar, arguing that it's superfluous and it would be more correct to write the title without it. He regularly added material, as he does here, about the meanings that had accrued to words used in the scriptures in later and rabbinical Hebrew, adding rabbinical expressions and quotations. And he filled in, this is absolutely extraordinary, every Hebrew quotation from the Bible. Pagnini had quoted thousands of passages, giving the Vulgate translation and only the word at issue in Hebrew. And Isaac entered the full Hebrew text of every single Hebrew quotation, so far as it was possible. So I think we could call this not just correction, but extreme correction, the sort of correction that a publisher like Plantin wanted to boast of. Extreme correction involved making some complicated and demanding decisions, and it meant answering questions that went to the core of Isaac's own identity and the identity of correction itself. Was the corrector simply the editor making the best of an older text, or was he the author's superior, adding to the text? Occasionally, as Isaac worked on Pagnini, he made clear that he saw himself as the descendant of and pupil of Jewish learned men, superior to any Christian scholar in his ability to correct this text. So he describes himself as being able to correct because he is the inheritor of a particularly Jewish tradition of scholarship. 1 Samuel 26:7 states that when David and Abishai come to find Saul, he's sleeping within the barricade, Bamagal, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. And Isaac insists that this Magal was a fort assembled by wagons. My elders and teachers, great scholars, always told me that Magal means in German, ein Wagenburg, a wagon train. So here and elsewhere, though he's a Christian convert, he insists that it's his particularly Jewish knowledge that gives him the right to rewrite the book. Yet at other times, he distances himself from his origins. Like dozens of other Christian scholars, Pagnini discussed the very important question whether an alma is necessarily a virgin or just a young woman. It's a crucial question because in Isaiah 30, an alma brings forth a child, and the Christological reading of this passage was, of course, deeply rooted in Christianity. Isaac discusses it, and very characteristically for him, not in connection with Isaiah, but in connection with Proverbs 30. There are 3 things which are wonderful for me, yea, 4 which I know not. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent upon a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of a sea, and the way of a man with an alma, the way of a man with a young woman. So is the way of an adulterous woman. She eateth and wipeth her mouth and saith, I have done no wickedness. In a long annotation, Isaac recalled making a visit to the great Christian printer of Jewish books, Daniel Bomberg, and talking with him about this question. Daniel Bomberg, a pious man and an expert Hebraist, had gorgeous arguments against the Jews at this point in Proverbs 30. I heard them from him in the year 1549, and I noted them down, but I lost them. At this point, the proud Levite and inheritor of Jewish tradition clearly identifies himself as a Christian, able to correct the text properly because of his Christian understanding of its Christological meanings. As Isaac worked in this text, in other words, the different personae or the different habitus that he carried as corrector changed and shifted dizzyingly, and so sometimes did the principles that he employed. Some of these shifts were induced by the fact that he was engaged in polemics with Christian scholars. Lawrence Humphrey, later to be master of Magdalen College, Oxford, spent the 1550s in the Marian exile as a proof corrector in the house of Froben and Episcopius. And you can actually see him in the Froben pay list up on top, Laurentius Humfridis Castigator. Among the books that he corrected was a Hebrew lexicon by Johannes Forster, a Hebrew lexicon which advertised, as Humphrey explained, that it was based solely on the Bible, not on the Kabbalah, since it uses Christ, not the Kabbalah as interpreters, the apostles, not rabbis or Talmudists. This kind of thing infuriated Isaac, and many of the notes in his corrections to Pagnini reflect his efforts to refute Christians. Yet other contacts with Christians provoked him not to polemics, but to going deep into the resources of Jewish tradition in order to satisfy them. One of those independent notes records a conversation of 1563 with Plantin's partner, the physician and historian Johannes Goropius Becanus, one of the great scholars of the 1560s and a man very dear to me for his theory that Dutch was the language spoken in the Garden of Eden. You could tell this because Dutch has more monosyllables than any other language. So Becanus was actually himself a very good Hebraist and a terrific Greek scholar and a very cosmopolitan and open man, asked Isaac while he was at work correcting why in Deuteronomy 32:8, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, says, God set the borders of the peoples according to the number of the angels, while the Hebrew says according to the number of the children of Israel. And Isaac assured him, in a tradition that he clearly saw as Jewish, that both readings were actually rooted in the tradition. Both of them reflected the deeper meaning of the text, and he then provided a Kabbalistic explanation of the angels of the different nations, drawn from the Italian biblical commentator and Kabbalist Menachem Recanati, one of the most popular Jewish writers of this period. So, in other words, Isaac's encounters with Christian scholarship could make him pose as an indignant Jew, make him pose as a Christian, make him pose as a Jew who was happy to inform Christians. One more form of Christian correction also played a role in shaping Isaac's work. In March 1564, Plantin took Isaac and the amended lexicon to Louvain to show it to the censor, a priest and Hebrew professor named Kurner, who would later become a famous bishop. Now, a central form of correction, and the connection has not been made often enough, was censorship. Censors, like correctors, sought, when they censored a book, not just to remove anything that was doctrinally problematic, but also to identify and remove stylistic and factual errors. Juan Caramueli Lobkowitz, who wrote a book on censorship and preparing texts for publication in 1660, actually raises the moral question whether it's legitimate to correct factual errors in a text by a dead man, since you seem to be portraying him as more perfect than he actually is. So the censor was a corrector. And the censor, of course, was a particularly weighty and serious corrector. In the 1560s and 70s, even great Christian scholars were feeling the weight of censorship. Here you see a rare document that floated out of the archive of the Inquisition into the Vatican. This is the censor's report on Carlo Sigonio's mistakes, great professor of history at Bologna. But the Congregation of the Index chastised him for following the error of Erasmus, who, as they say, asserted that there could be errors in the Holy Bible as the result of the human condition of scribes. The Council of Trent had determined that Christians were to rely on the Vulgate Bible. When Sigonio suggested that it might contain errors, he was approaching a larger heresy. So to edit a dictionary of biblical Hebrew meant running risks of making this kind of mistake at any kind. Happily, Plantin knew his censor. It was very important for a publisher to know which censor to take which book to. In this case, he took the censor to Kurner, who went through it pretty rapidly. On the 9th of March, he noted that columns 1 to 1,416 could be printed. On the 10th of March, he did the same for the second 1,400 columns. So I think we can fairly say that he didn't read the book terribly carefully. Nonetheless, his approval took account of something else, and this really shows the censor's hand digging in. He approved everything, he said, quae non sunt deleta, everything that hadn't been crossed out. And you'll have noticed many crossings out in the notes that I've shown you. And it's in those crossings out that you can see Isaac, this strange and very self-willed man, exercising what must have been a painful kind of self-censorship. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. Among the thousands of words that Pagnini defines is pilegesh, concubine, which is quite a curious word. Some think, wrote Isaac in the morning, that this is a compound word from isha, woman or wife, and pileg, divide, that is, half a wife. For since they're not legally married, they're taken not for a whole wife, but for a half wife. But I don't think this etymology is true, for I've seen plenty of concubines who claimed more control over their husbands than any legal wife would dare to. It's a grammarian's little joke, and as you see, that kind of little joke withered in the cold new climate of the Counter-Reformation. So did his references to Kabbalistic discussions of the angels, which had to be crossed out. So did his reference to Bomberg's argument against the Jews. Isaac's publisher knew his way around the censor's system, something which many publishers did, as Bob Darnton and students of his like Jeffrey Friedman have shown us. But correcting under a regime of suspicion still was something like writing under such a regime. The corrector answered to another corrector who took up residence in his mind and told him how to go back through his own work and make it harmless before he produced it for formal inspection. And even this form of self-censorship might not be adequate to the problems raised by a project like a Hebrew dictionary, as is suggested from the fact that the dictionary was never actually printed, despite the enormous amount that Plantin had already invested in preparing it. Now, Isaac was far from alone in confronting multiple problems and traditions. Consider a much more familiar case, one that Italianists like Peter Brown, Brian Richardson, and Paolo Trovato have studied, that of the great debates that raged between Venetian and Florentine printing houses in the same period over the way to print the Tuscan classics. In those cases, too, correctors found themselves engaging in a sharp intellectual debate about philological first principles. And in those cases, too, a neat solution proved impossible to find. How do you print Boccaccio's Decameron in an age of ecclesiastical censorship? Do you print the most accurate case you can of one of the Tuscan classics, the books that define the new language of culture? Or do you apply the new criteria of Catholic piety and decorum, which hold that stories about amorous monks and priests must not be put before innocent readers, lest they corrupt? Leonardo Salviati tried to solve this problem in 1582 in his edition of the Decameron. Here's what becomes of one passage. Every asterisk stands for a word or phrase that he's omitted. And here you see him feebly saying, I've left these fragments just to preserve a few words, as many words and idioms as I can. It's pathetic. Every time the word priest appeared in Boccaccio, Salviati put in student. So once again, you see the corrector struggling with what really are multiple identities. On the one hand, the scholar trying to preserve a tradition. On the other hand, the literary professional trying to make his work publishable in an age when publishing could bring great danger. So correctors had multiple personalities. That was one of their problems. The second problem is that correctors had multiple statuses. They had a social status as learned men and an economic status as poor devils, and that was also very difficult to live with. Now, you can tell that correctors had a certain cultural status. Their names always came first in the payrolls because they were the most learned employees of the printing shop. But their pay was actually slightly lower than that of the most skillful compositors and pressmen, which can't have been easy for them to live with. The rich archives of the Plantin house record the lives of correctors like Raphaelengius or Cornelis Kilian, who worked for decades, who were recognized by the publisher and by authors for their extraordinary services to learning. Here we have something wonderful. This is a surviving proof sheet from Plantin's Polyglot Bible. A fair number of these survive, bearing the ink stains that show they were used in the composing room. And here, Benito Arias Montano, the great Spanish Hebraist who edited the book, tells Franciscus Raphaelengius, who has just recovered from some danger, that he's just told Plantin that I hold you in the place of a dear brother. So he holds him in the place of his dear brother in a claim of fictive kinship. Yet the archives also preserve the sad case of Olivier Affine, a corrector who worked for 13 years. We see him being paid faithfully week by week by week, and suddenly the ledger breaks off and all it says is, "Il est parti malcontent et sans dire adieu." He left discontented and without even saying goodbye. It's like the slam of a door at the end of a doll's house when Nora leaves. We'd love to know what happened. The toad beneath the harrow knows exactly where each tooth point goes, and I think Plantin's correctors knew exactly what was being done to them. The Concordia, which is they didn't have a guild, but they did have an organization of the Guild of St. Luke. It didn't have guild privileges, but they met on St. Luke's Day and held a feast. And the document that records this also records the rumors, the whispers that passed among them at these feasts. I often heard from others, and the Venerable Decline heard from Master van der Weyden, and Hieronymus de Bravio heard from van der Weyden as well, that the correctors used to receive a raise when they had been here for 2 years. Noyan, the aforesaid Decline, also heard this often. So the correctors grumbled a great deal, as Plantin grumbled to friends in his turn. A limiting case, this also emerging from those wonderful inky proof sheets of the Antwerp Polyglot, makes clear just how low the lowest rung of the corrector's ladder seemed. Now, the first thing you did if you wanted to be a corrector was to be a reader. You would read the copy aloud for 6 months or a year, and if you did that accurately and well every year while the corrector went along in the proof, then you might earn promotion to the rank of corrector. So these young men from university who became correctors all started as readers. Plantin was a Dutchman, and Dutchmen are efficient in the disposing of resources. In order to keep the products of his many presses corrected without paying more than he could afford, he put his 4 daughters to work, or so he tells us, training each of them in turn to be a reader, training them to read aloud, not only in Latin, but also in Greek, in Hebrew, in Arabic, and Aramaic. He describes these feats in several letters to friends, and it was always thought that he was perhaps exaggerating, as a proud father might. But in 1570, he wrote of his 4th and last daughter, Magdalena, born in 1557, that she was just 13, and that she was taking the proof sheets of the Polyglot Bible to Ariath Montano and reading them to him. He was going to have to stop this, unfortunately, because he thought 13 was the oldest a girl could be to work with men decently. After that, she would have to work in the shop, and he would actually have to pay a reader or find another younger sister. Now, for a long time, we wondered if this claim could possibly be true. They wondered at the time, we wondered now. But one of the proof sheets surfaced, nice and inky. Up there you see Montano's seal with which he signed every page of the proofs, Talmud, Judeo-Arabic for student or learned person. That's what Philip II himself required him to do that. You see the learned man getting ink on his fingers. And here you see a little note in Hebrew from Montano to Raphaelengius telling, "You should say to this girl that she should hasten to come, for every day she procrastinates too much." A letter written in Hebrew so the proud father wouldn't be able to read it, and clearly attesting that this 13-year-old girl was working as a reader. So imagine what you felt like as a normal male corrector in possession of a basic university degree, working at the greatest print shop in Europe, Plantin's shop in Antwerp, when you realized that a 10-year-old girl could do the same job you were doing. I think we can see that the learned corrector suffered an acute case of what David Brooks calls status income disequilibrium. And this shakiness of your cultural and social superiority must have been endlessly grating. It was made more grating by another factor. Most correctors started as university men, educated men who entered the printing shop to use their literate skills. But compositors had to be basically literate as well, and some were more than that. Compositors, moreover, did some correcting. For every compositor produced at the very beginning of setting a sheet what was called a foul proof, a proof that only he would ever look at and that he himself would correct. This is a foul proof from a Cambridge printing shop, which exceptionally survived in the binding of a book in the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge. It was not a long move from correcting foul proof to correcting proof, especially as literacy progressed in the Reformation and many correctors were widely read in vernacular literature. To the corrector, it must have been tremendously threatening to see that skilled compositors not only out-earned them, but also threatened their own calling. And we can see from the payrolls that compositors and pressmen could become correctors and be paid for correcting. It's in this context that I like to read the one last bit of this wood engraving that we haven't looked at before. It's very odd. You see a man who wears a doublet and a ruff, the sign of someone of social elevation, working with a composing stick. His dress indicates that he is a learned man, but his hands must be dirty and he's working with them. I think he's one of these hermaphroditic figures, a compositor who has learned to be a corrector and also claims learned status, or possibly a corrector who has learned to do a little bit of work with the type and who, because he's a habitué of the shop, is allowed to do so. My father, as a newspaperman in the 1930s, not only learned to read proof backwards and upside down very rapidly, because when you changed the front page, you had to read off the type. There wasn't even time to pull a sheet and read it, but was also allowed to fool around with the composing machine by the compositors with whom he worked. So I like to imagine this person as a figure rather like my father, but I think he's a threatening figure from the standpoint of most correctors. Yet these amphibian figures, harassed and underfed, often complaining about their illness, especially their eye ailments, as you can imagine in their letters, celebrated occasional triumphs, and I'd like to close with one. Giorgio Vasari was not able to put the first edition of his History of Art through the Torrentino's press when it appeared in Florence in 1550. He was off in Rome pursuing his vocation as a second-rate but very skillful painter. Fortunately, he had help from some of the best print professionals around, Pier Francesco Giambulari, Cosimo Bartoli, and above all, the Benedictine scholar Vincenzo Borghini. They put the work through the press for him. And this was more or less the beginning of a long and interesting relationship between Borghini and Vasari, one that's been traced by many scholars from Robert Williams and Thomas Frangenberg to most recently Marco Ruffini. What they've shown is that after 1550, Borghini and Vasari engaged in what amounted to a long collaboration as the second edition of Vasari's History of Art took shape. Borghini was a press professional who wrote prefaces, designed title pages, knew his way around the printing shop. And Borghini pressed Vasari on every element of his book, from its indexing, which he himself carried out, to its content. He pushed Vasari not to waste space on the personal lives of painters. Nobody cares about the personal lives of painters, he said. They only care about the personal lives of significant people. Concentrate on the art. He pushed and reshaped the work, which, as Ruffini shows, ends up not as the writing of a single author, but as a collaboration, and actually a collaboration which often tells you the details of the collaborations that produced the great works of Renaissance art. A remarkable and complicated achievement. It was all the result of a collaboration, and Borghini expressed it in August 1556 with a magnificently vivid, weird metaphor, one that both, I think, captures the intimate and intensive nature of the work they both did, identifies the distinct roles they played, and explains why Vasari was the author and Borghini was only the editor. As I said, we'll have to chew on this together. You'll be the upper teeth, and I'll be the lower. Now, as I said, it's a good thing that it was Vasari who was doing the writing and Borghini who was doing the editing, because he was an extraordinarily passionate and skillful editor, and his work was vital twice to the creation of two different iterations of a Renaissance masterpiece. Without this corrector, we wouldn't have Vasari's Lives of the Artists, one of the defining works of Renaissance literature. In his mastery of both high literary skills and the details of book production, the decorum of language, and his literary tact, Borghini represents the ideal figure of the Renaissance corrector. And Vasari, in his willingness to accept correction, represents a kind of Renaissance author whom the correctors encountered all too rarely. Someone much more grateful, evidently, than Raymond Carver for the work done for him by his Gordon Lish. So, among the modern figures who walked the streets and squares of the Renaissance city, adapting what were sometimes ancient and traditional skills to new ends, sometimes with their heads swimming in confusion, sometimes with extraordinary direction and precision, were the literary editors, the lineal ancestors of Maxwell Perkins and Gordon Lish, Pedro Zuurkamp and George Weidenfeld, Giulio Einaudi, Barbara Epstein, Elizabeth Sifton, will be hard put to live and even harder put to read without their professional descendants. Thank you. Now, if there are, I see a question.
I was waiting to hear about a real editor after your introduction until the very end when I heard about Borghini. And you slipped in your terminology calling Borghini an editor and a corrector. But all the rest of the talk seemed to me about correctors, people we would call line editors, people who you met who are frustrated with authors because they don't know how to be consistent with capitalization or tense and so on and so forth. But it seemed to me that you had no example other than Borghini of somebody who was really consciously trying to change the conception of a word, consciously trying to change sentences, paragraph, chapter divisions, the way Maxwell Perkins and the contemporaries in the 20th century were. And I wonder, was that just an exception, or was there something like an editor as opposed to a compositor?
I disagree, because I think Johannes Isaac was exactly doing that. He was doing it to a dictionary rather than a work of literature, but he had clearly reconceived this dictionary, a major work of scholarship, and was transforming it. So in fact, I think my major example, though he's not doing literary editing, he's definitely editing in the formal radical sense that I would use for Borghini. So in fact, I don't quite agree with you. But your question is a good one, and I'm glad you asked it. In fact, yes, there are many cases of editors whose interventions are quite radical, and I'll give you one more, and I do think your question is a good one. That's Andreas Osiander. Osiander, as some of you know, put Copernicus's De Revolutionibus through the press in 1543. And he did two things which are really quite remarkable. One is to introduce corrections in the text of a technical kind, which are actually correct. We can tell this because it's a mathematical and scientific text. So he actually redoes Copernicus's computations, and in a fair number of cases, he corrects them. And that is also a form of real editing. He's pushing the work to be more precise. The other thing he did was to add a preface, which he didn't sign, in which he said, by the way, this work is only a hypothesis. Don't worry. Don't be bothered. There's nothing going on here. Don't look. And the important thing about doing that was, of course, that Copernicus had said, by the way, my work is about reality. This is an account of the universe as it really is. Osiander brilliantly saw that by putting a preface at the start which disclaimed that, he would make the work much more difficult to censor. And indeed, as Owen Gingerich has shown, it proved impossible to suppress by censorship. It circulated, it became the standard for astronomical teaching. It was heavily annotated in multiple copies. So that too, I would argue, is a kind of editing. It didn't involve reshaping the work as a whole, but editing often doesn't. It involved one radical intervention at the start. The editor that I work with most often at Harvard University Press is a fanatic for titles, which may explain why the titles of my works are somewhat chiseled, because he rejects the first 50 in each case. He doesn't push on most of the rest of the book. So I'm going to disagree with you and say I think it is actually not slippage to call these people editors. Borghini is a particularly strong case because he's actually intervening at every level in the shape of a work of, which is recognized as a great work of literature. But he's only at the edge of what I think is quite normal for the calling. And I have lots of other examples that I can provide if you want. Yes?
I have a few Dutch-related questions. One, who is it who said that Dutch might be the language that was spoken in?
Johannes van Gorp, Goropius
Native
Taconis.
speaker, I'm grateful to know. Second, my recollection is that Raphaelengius was Plantin's son-in-law.
That's right.
So for Montanus to call him my Christian brother might actually have been an extension of a sort of familial industry feeling at the Plantin house.
But Montano didn't live in the house and clearly wasn't part of the family. He was a Spanish grandee, and so I thought about that, but no, it seems to me to be stronger than that.
Okay, and my actual question does have something to do with Raphaelengius, who took over production in Leiden, and where, among other things, he produced a purely editorial form of intervention in botanical publication, form that consists of, sort of cut and paste versions of previously published herbals, right? So not satisfied with the taxonomy such as it was that had been produced and regenerated in publications in Germany and then subsequently in the Flemish country or lands. He then cut and pasted images of the plants that had been previously described with some of the text and then reinserted them in his own order. And this got me to thinking about something you talked about, editorial or copy editing marks, symbols. And I wondered if you could talk, are there other ways, so I'm thinking obviously of this Raphaelengius example, in which early editorial interventions actually shape the production of text subsequently? Sure.
Actually, with technical texts, that's fairly normal, as it had been in manuscript transmission. That is, it was always the case that works like Lexica and Compendia were more fluid in their transmission than literary works. It is common for historians, there's this weird thing that people who do what they call book history tend to work in print rather than in the manuscript world. And so they tend to say these strange things like there's no sense of literary property or originality until copyright. And you go back and you see Horace saying, this thing I wrote is going to be here when brass and stone aren't. And you go, I think Horace had some idea about literary originality and property, or at least I continue to think so. But all kinds of technical works are changeable in the script, often in the scriptorium, and they're also highly changeable, mutable in the printing shop. Raphaelengius really was reluctant to make decisions in his younger days. And there's actually a fascinating letter about the production of the Polyglot Bible, which makes clear that he and Montano each wanted the other to choose the Greek text, and neither of them wanted to be the one who was responsible for deciding if the Comma Johanneum, which is the one New Testament testimony that explicitly mentions the Trinity, was going to be in the text or not, or the other cruces were going to be settled. So, but late in life, he's a professor at Leiden. He's a much grander figure than he had been in Antwerp, and he clearly allowed himself to take a more active part.
Sir. On more modern works, do you have any idea whether editors had any significant effect on works like Finnegans Wake or any of Beckett's works?
Well, compositors had, of course, a tremendous effect on Ulysses, since the compositors of the first edition were French and didn't know English. And left an impress on that, which, in some ways has been worked out by every subsequent edition of Ulysses with great difficulty, that's the origin of the great Ulysses scandal of the 1980s, when Gobler's edition messed up a lot of this. But who can we think in the 20th century? I think the major modernist work which really bears the sign of editing is The Wasteland. And there we can tell from the manuscript in the Berg collection that it was really transformed by Pound's intervention. This is no exaggeration. The poem, we know, would not exist without Pound. So that's the strongest single case that I know. But editing remained interventionist for a long time. There's a really wonderful bad novel by Herman Wouk that I use in my course on book history called Youngblood Hawk. which is absolutely awful. And there's an absolutely awful movie made from it, but I don't have the gall to show them that. It's a novel about fiction writing in the 40s and 50s, and it's really the story of Thomas Wolfe set a little bit later chronologically, and in which the impact of the line editor on the writer becomes a scandal. And, and it's quite true that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there were line editors who had tremendous impact on the texture of novels. And there were editors like Perkins who had tremendous impact on the shape of writing. Certainly Fitzgerald's novels are often reshaped in response to Perkins. Perkins couldn't spell for beans any more than Fitzgerald, so he didn't actually do a lot of line editing. But he did push Tender as the Night, which was radically reshaped in response to his thinking. He had a big impact on Gatsby and on the early novels as well.
I work at Northwestern University Press as a corrector.
Wow! They reappear from the shadows.
I liked everything you said, but looking at the woodcut that you were showing, we correspond with our authors via email. I was wondering if the practice was really for the authors to visit the print shop, or whether they sent manuscripts back and forth, or what they did.
This is an extremely complicated question, and you settle it, it can only be settled book by book. So if an author wanted to correct the proofs himself, which some did, he or she had to be at the printing shop, because you basically wanted to do a sheet a day. So in order to correct, you'd have to be there when the sheet came off the press, correct it, be there for the next iteration, be there for then you could go away, but you'd have to be there the next morning to do the next sheet. And some authors actually did this, particularly at universities where the press would often be a university or college press and would be right there. Venetian authors have access to the great Venetian printers. But when an author couldn't be there, you could have a wonderful trouble. I have a wonderful errata slip by a writer called Bibliander Buchmann, whose book was published by the press of Operinus in Basel, very, very good press, which had a house style of spelling and punctuation, which wasn't his. And he didn't know, so he gets the book and it's already done. And so all he can do is write this long, furious thing in the errata saying, well, some people spell things one way and some spell them another way. So what you very rarely get is an author who is away having much impact on the shape of the book. The only case I know of, the only cases I found of this are with Plantin, who was an extremely painstaking publisher, and he would have his presses doing a dance. So he would set one gathering, pull one sheet, set it, send it to the author for approval before he made final decisions about which type font to use, about which paper to use, which format to use. And he would do his best actually to work with the authors. And Plantin is actually another case of somebody who will correspond with authors and say, you know, your Hebrew grammar is terrific, but I think it could be laid out in a different way, which would make it easier to memorize. So he really would talk about shape. And his Balthazar Moretus, who took over the firm, does the same. I have a wonderful letter from him to Justus Lipsius, great, great scholar, about a third person who submitted a book. And Moretus says, the trouble is, in the first place, his handwriting terrifies us because we can't read it. And in the second place, it's full of mistakes. He has a mistake of usage actually in the title. And so what am I going to tell this guy? I don't want to insult him, but I really have to rewrite his Latin. And the book was printed with the Latin rewritten. So again, a successful case of editing. Unfortunately, I don't have the documents that would explain the process. Yes?
You describe a world of the corrector that is with hyper devotion to precision, and at the same time it's a period of time of a lot of self-censorship or helping these others censor themselves, and so all that precision might go out the window. You have to cut out better words. And then there's a storyline in terms of economic status, of sort of underemployment perhaps. So I'm wondering if you could describe this group collectively, sort of marginal intellectuals in like the Dutch Republic, and if they have a sort of shared political orientation or philosophical orientation. Could you get that far?
They don't have I mean, you can't bring them all together, but in the 17th century, in the exiled French printing world of the Protestant refuge after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, the correctors are the ones who really turn the publishing houses into the bastions of enlightenment and criticism. And it's people like Jean Leclerc, who starts as a corrector, who become journalists, who work as agents and intermediaries between authors and publishers, who help publishers to define lines of writing that are in a particular way critical of Catholic orthodoxy or of the autocracy of Louis XIV. There's a wonderful book by Anne Goldgar, Impolite Learning, which tells that story just beautifully and hilariously and brilliantly. Beth?
It follows really on the last question. You have the stories of correctors protecting their authors from lack of orthodoxy, but do you ever find cases of correctors actually getting fired or shoved out because they are not upholding orthodoxy and someone notices this, be it an author or someone else, and saying, it's got to go?
I haven't found that. I have certainly found correctors whose bosses suspect them of unorthodoxy, but the only case I found is that one of the Schweißtuch, which I'm not certain I actually believe in the historicity of that case, though it's pretty wonderful. But certainly Plantin gets rid of people because he thinks they are radical Calvinists, and though his own religious alignment is extremely difficult to establish, he's not on the side of the really radical Protestants. That's for certain. So sure, they have political dangers. Sir.
I would like to return to Isaac Levita.
Yeah.
You showed one frame very briefly, and you mentioned Levita at a certain point wrote a book defending his skills and himself as an editor. And what strikes me is that the title of the book, if I see it correct on the screen, is Kinat Sofrim. Kinat Sofrim is the title for the books that are produced for people who create Torah scrolls. Right? So Kinat Sofrim is the envy of the scribes. So he calls the book about himself as a Christian editor, Kinat Sofrim, with this interesting Hebrew twist, comparing by default what they do while they write Torah scrolls to what he does correcting the books. Can you tell us more about the book? This seems to be a very interesting case of, going across the board without.
And once again, it's a case where he is strongly identifying himself with the Jewish tradition. So you're absolutely right. The Jewish tradition that he has in mind is partly that of the scribes, but it's really that of the Masoretes. So the Masoretes are the grammarians who had more or less stabilized the text of the Hebrew Bible and attached two apparatuses onto it, which, among other things, revocalize certain words for reading, which give you the numbers of certain phenomena. In 1538 to 39, Elijah Levita had written the Masoret HaMasoret, which is a detailed account of that apparatus, which really then is the part of that is translated into Latin in 39 and makes this learning available to Christians for the first time. So what Levita is doing is Johannes Isaac Levita is fiercely defending that tradition and arguing that it was not a corrupting tradition, but a work of grammarians who were doing their skillful best to preserve the correct readings and in some cases the correct double senses of passages in Scripture. So he's absolutely identifying himself there as a representative of a Jewish tradition, Masoretic tradition, and identifying himself, I think, as a Levite and a scholar, with Elijah Levita as Levite and scholar. So the echo is absolutely there. And he's defending himself against Catholic critics of the Hebrew text. I didn't have time to go into this, but the great problem of the Antwerp Polyglot Bible, which is a Catholic product funded by Philip II of Spain, is that the church at the Council of Trent had defined the Vulgate as the authoritative text of the Bible. Here comes an 8-volume polyglot with Hebrew, Greek, Latin texts of the Old Testament and Greek and Syriac and Latin texts of the New Testament, and a very elaborate apparatus suggesting that, in fact, you can't ever know for certain which is the text in that sense that the council had defined So this is a work which sets off a firestorm of criticism, especially in Spain, where Montano came from. At one point, he marvelously, you just know how he feels. He writes a preface in which he tries to take compromise positions on these views, prints it with extra wide margins, and sends it to 10 of his critics and says, "Here, tell me what I should change." Then he gets all 10 back and says, "Oi." There's absolutely no way he can reconcile their opinions. So he finally prints what he thinks is correct and honest, and suffers a lot of slings and arrows, but in the end he wins. There's a lot more Hebrew scholarship in the Catholic Church than we tend to think, a lot more Hebraic scholarship as well. There's a legend that it's all Protestants who do this stuff, which isn't really true. In 1580, when Michel de Montaigne visits the Vatican Library, and they pull out all the stuff they show to visiting firemen, the Chinese paper, the assertion of the Seven Sacraments by Henry VIII before he changed his mind, there are these things that they show to the important, they still show you these things if you go to the Vatican, when the American ambassador to the Vatican comes, this is still the same stuff they pull out. One of the things they pull out to show Montaigne is the Antwerp Polyglot Bible. See, we're up to date, we do cool philology too. So in that sense, Montano actually wins, and it's a great and amazing cultural victory, won at great, great price. So yeah, Levita is he's really a fascinating individual, and having this document which puts him in the printing house and shows him dealing in the way always difficult for a convert with Christians and in this extraordinary manner, it's really a very distinctive document. And in a way, I'm delighted that the thing was never published, because then they would have neatened it up and destroyed this rough draft, which really shows, gives us so much insight. Yes.
Was there any kind of proofreading tradition before the Renaissance, like with the handwritten?
Oh yeah, this is ancient. This is the other thing. This is ancient. In the ancient world, any manuscript had to be proofread, any proper manuscript. And the real discipline of proofing in the 4th century was the same oral one that you see in the printing shop. So in Caesarea and Palestine, when they produced a Greek text of the Bible, there was an anagnostes, which is a lector, someone who reads aloud from the old copy, and a diorthotes, a corrector who corrected. And in Codex Sinaiticus, we have these colophons that come from Pamphilus and Eusebius. Pamphilus was the teacher of the great Eusebius. So already in the 4th century, they're doing correcting. They're in Aulus Gellius, the great Roman grammarian. There's wonderful anecdotes about correcting. The corrector who goes to a shop and is offered a specially valuable copy of the Annales of Fabius Maximus and finds a mistake on the first page. This is, despite the fact that it's supposed to be super correct. So this is an ancient discipline. It lasts right through the Middle Ages. There are correctors in every good scriptorium. There are correctors in the ateliers of the cities. There are correctors at table in the well-organized monastic houses who correct what you say and what you sing at table in the refectory. So correction, there's a huge, huge story of correction, and the story in print is only one chapter in that longer and much more obscure one, which goes right back into the ancient world. Probably Homer had a corrector. So one more here.
One more question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just wanted to mention the correctors tradition continued into the 20th century in monastic communities.
Oh, and of course, there's a great tradition of the Bible, Torah scrolls have to be absolutely correct. I mean, there are many, many traditions of correcting. Sadly, though, the great tradition of correcting in English language publishing houses is very hard to sustain now because the finances make it incredibly difficult. And great presses have, if not abandoned, at least lowered the standards that they once had. I had the great good fortune that my first book was published by the Clarendon Press. I didn't get the greatest copy editor of the 20th century, Leo Frank Halford Strevens, the Oxford copy editor who knows something like 120 languages. And he actually does. It's astonishing. But I got John Vash, the second copy editor. He sent me 50 single-spaced pages of observations on my manuscript. The manuscript was 1,200 pages long, so this was not totally out of keeping. And they were observations of the kind, I don't know if you want to force this optative quite as severely as you seem to be doing here. He checked every text, every translation, and when he found a difficulty he wasn't certain of, he would consult Leo Frank Halford Strevens, whom he referred to always as my colleague. I think it's fair to say that no publishing house is doing that anymore, because the finances simply aren't there to support it. And in some great houses like Oxford, which do make a lot of money, the policies aren't there to support it anymore. And that seems to me a great pity. This was an extraordinary discipline, and I don't think spell check is going to supplant it.
Let me do two things. First, you're all invited to a reception after this, and perhaps talk to Tony. Please stay. And second, thank you for a terrific lecture.
Thank you so much.